Imagine being a London policeman in the 1880s. You might expect to be chasing thieves or breaking up violent crime, but on a single shift you could be called to a man stealing dogs not to keep them, but to ransom them back, a driver arrested for going too fast in a horse and cart, streets so filthy they became a crime scene in themselves, and even people being prosecuted for taking photographs. This was everyday policing in Victorian London. And over the next few minutes, we're going to follow several officers through a single shift as they encounter some of the strangest crimes you've never heard of. One constable slows at the mouth of a narrow street, his attention caught by a man lingering there, something moving beneath his coat. Dog theft was surprisingly common in Victorian London, but not for the reason you might expect. The animal itself wasn't always the prize. Instead, thieves would wait for the inevitable notice to appear. Lost dog. Reward offered. And then, days later, the same dog would be quietly returned, no questions asked, reward collected. A simple scheme. Difficult to prove. Repeated again and again across the city. And for the officer watching on, it left an uncomfortable question. Was he witnessing a crime, or simply a man returning a lost dog? Further along his route, another officer slows, not because of a person, but because of the street itself. In Victorian London, mud and manure weren't just unpleasant, they could be a crime. With thousands of horses moving through the city every day, the streets quickly filled with waste. Left unchecked, it built up into thick layers that blocked movement, caused accidents, and created serious health concerns. Property owners were expected to keep the ground outside their premises clear. Drivers too could be held responsible if they left excessive filth behind. And sometimes it didn't stay on the ground for long. Arguments between neighbours or passers-by could quickly escalate into people throwing it. Not far away, another officer steps sharply into the road, hand raised as a cart comes rattling towards him at speed. In Victorian London, this was known as furious driving. With no traffic lights, no lanes, and streets crowded with pedestrians, even a modest increase in speed could turn dangerous very quickly. Drivers pushing their horses too hard, racing deliveries, cutting through tight streets and ignoring corners. There was no general driving licence for ordinary horse cart drivers, so skill and experience varied enormously. In theory, almost anyone with a horse and cart could drive through the streets of London. A short distance away, another constable pauses, this time at a small crowd gathering around a man with a tripod and a large wooden camera. Photography was still a novelty in Victorian London, but not always a welcome one. Setting up equipment in busy streets could quickly cause obstruction, drawing crowds, blocking movement and disrupting traffic. And long exposure times meant people had to stand still, sometimes in the middle of already crowded roads. For the constable, the issue wasn't the photograph itself. It was everything that came with it. In a city already struggling for space, a non-essential novelty like this was not always welcome, especially when it began to draw a crowd. As the shift goes on, one officer comes across a winter nuisance that now seems almost absurd. The street has frozen over, and a group of boys are using the icy surface as a slide, running, skidding, and sending each other the length of the road for fun. Harmless at first glance. But this was still a public street, and before long they were obstructing the road, forcing pedestrians to step around them and drawing more people in. In Victorian London, that was enough to bring the police over. What looked like a game could quickly become a public nuisance. Elsewhere, another constable pauses at a market stall, where nothing appears obviously wrong. But not all food in Victorian London was what it claimed to be. Milk was often watered down. Bread could be mixed with cheaper fillers. And meat, if it could still be sold, often was. It wasn't always easy to spot, which meant much of it passed from seller to buyer, unnoticed. In markets like these, trust carried the transaction, and that trust was not always well placed. In some parts of the city, the next problem was harder to ignore. Tucked behind houses, or wandering into narrow streets, pigs were sometimes kept within the city itself. For those who owned them, They were valuable sources of food and income. But in tightly packed neighbourhoods, they brought noise, smell, and constant complaints. Keeping them in the wrong place, or allowing them to roam, could bring the police to your door. In streets like these, the line between livelihood and nuisance was often a thin one. As evening draws in, another constable moves into a poorly lit road. Street lighting wasn't uniform. While main roads were lit, smaller streets often relied on lamps outside homes and businesses. In some areas, householders and shopkeepers were expected to keep a lamp burning outside their premises. When they didn't, sections of the street were left in shadow, which was easy to overlook. But in a city like this, even a small pocket of darkness could change how a street functioned. Darkness increased the risk of crime, so the constable notes it and stops. Another small offence, another door to knock on, before the street disappears into darkness. As the day moves into night, another officer steps inside a public house, where the offence is measured more precisely. A pint was expected to be a pint, but not every customer received one. Short measure, serving less than the full amount, was a known and persistent problem. Difficult to notice in a crowded room, easy to repeat across dozens of customers. And over time, those small differences added up. Enough to draw complaints, and enough for the police to act when it was reported. Elsewhere, as night settles in, another constable stops outside a house that stands out, not by sight but by sound. Voices spilling into the street, movement at odd hours, people coming and going more frequently than expected, known simply as a disorderly house. The term was deliberately vague, covering anything from unlicensed drinking to overcrowded lodging, to places where order had quietly broken down. Difficult to define, but easy to recognise. And for the officer standing outside, it was often enough to warrant a knock at the door. As the early hours fade into morning, another officer moves through a quieter street, where the day is already beginning for some. A long pole taps rhythmically against an upstairs window. The knocker-up, a human alarm clock, paid to wake workers before dawn. Reliable, persistent, and not always appreciated. Missed the time, and there were complaints. Arrived too early or too often, and there could be shouting from windows and arguments in the street, and sometimes it escalated further. For the constable, this wasn't unusual. Even something as simple as waking someone up could quickly become a matter of public order. And with that, a long shift finally draws to a close.